Well, good morning and good evening, depending on which part of the world you're joining us from. But we are very excited to have Professor Tarun Khanna, who's a professor at HBS, but also the founding director of the Lakshmi Mittal South Asia Institute at Harvard University. And many of us who've been at Harvard at the university over the last couple of decades, at least I can say very safely, have had their time at Harvard shaped in one way or the other by Professor Khanna, his work, his conversations, many startups that have gotten a lot of support from him over the years. And so he's really a very significant figure in the lives of many students and alumni of the university. And so we are especially delighted to have you here, Professor Khanna, today for our first of the faculty speaker segments on the India at Harvard speaker series that we've started. So welcome.
Priyanka and Anirudh, thank you for inviting me, and great to be here. Nice to see you.
Great. And so Priyanka and I will be leading the discussion with our professor here today, and we'll be talking about a wide range of things, but we're going to keep it relevant to some of the more recent developments that have put India on the global map, or at least in the global conversations. The moon landing, the G20 summit that's happening soon, and various other such pieces. So we're looking forward to this conversation. The way we're going to structure this is we're going to spend the first 40 to 45 minutes going through some of these topics. And then, of course, for those who've joined us, if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat. And we'll try and pick up some of those questions, time permitting, towards the latter half of our discussion. So Priyanka, do you want to get us started?
Thank you, Anirudh. And Professor Khanna, thank you so much for your time today. This is very exciting for us to reconnect with you after almost a decade plus. So it's an exciting time to be Indian leadership. We are the fourth nation to land on the moon after the US, China, and the former Soviet Union. So this is really India's stake at being a superpower, right? It gets to boldly say that. Wanted to start the conversation today by asking you what you think this win describes of India's capabilities today.
Thank you, Priyanka. Look, it's a happy moment, first of all, and I was first in line with many hundreds of thousands, many millions cheering as the craft landed on the moon. In fact, I was pulling up in front of my daughter's apartment in Brookline, Mass, and I pulled over and I said, "Okay, let me just sit still while it lands." So it's a great moment. You saw the justified euphoria in India about this accomplishment. Kudos to ISRO, Indian Space Research Organization, for just an extraordinary thing. I mean, there was Mangalyaan before, and then a bit of a setback a little while back with the predecessor to Chandrayaan-3, which I assume was Chandrayaan-2, and now this victory. What it says is, of course, somewhat obvious that there is so much latent potential, despite the enormous headwinds to doing cutting-edge R&D in India. Every so often, we have a breakthrough, a genuine breakthrough. And I think this qualifies as one of those. Of course, it's not a craft that's as sophisticated or as heavy duty as some of the NASA sponsored or Western sponsored crafts by design. It had to be energy efficient. It had to do so within other, material and technological constraints. But the beauty is that the scientists came up with a very clever trajectory and a launch pattern and so on and so forth that, frankly, was an extraordinary way of optimizing within very different constraints. So mostly I'm heartened, and we can talk some more about it if you wish. And I'm looking forward to what I hope will be an impetus to a general awareness of R&D being absolutely fundamental to India fulfilling its potential. I can't think of any country in modern civilizational history that has transcended to middle or upper middle income status without significantly more attention to R&D than we have done in recent years.
And I mean, this capability to already have invested in space program, in potentially deep tech, and the future roadmap for R&D. I mean, how do you think India's being viewed globally, particularly in the US now with this win and these underlying capabilities that we are signaling to the market?
I have to say it's, of course, there's euphoria at the moment. And as I said, it's justified and appropriate. Our scientists should take a bow, particularly the ISRO scientists, well-deserved. But overall, I'd say the picture is pretty mixed. I mean, on the one hand, nobody doubts potential from India because you see amazing scientists, engineers, biologists, what have you, all over the US. You only have to look at leading tech companies in India to see that a lot of the senior ranks are populated by Indian origin, Indian educated scientists and technologically expert human capital. But on the other hand, people still associate India with relatively low-level R&D, rightly or wrongly. Of course, that's a blanket statement. There are areas, I would say, for instance, I don't know, pick something, computational biology, right, which doesn't require huge labs. It requires more simulation engines and computers and so on, where the lack of historic investment in fixed PP&E, property, plant, and equipment, for instance, and R&D over the years is less of a handicap. So there are niche areas of science where we excel, but in the main, people don't think of India in the same way as they've come to think of China as having put significant financial and national level organizational commitment behind R&D. They don't think of us at the same level as Israel, for instance, which has done the same thing, South Korea, or Singapore. And these are targets that are so well within our reach. I would say in less than a decade, one could get to comparable levels of awareness and achievement. So the moment is ours. Ours is in India's, and we just haven't sort of summoned up the gumption. And I hope we talk about, beyond ISRO. Priyanka knows this. You said you were working on digital public goods, right? The whole iSprit in Bangalore, Nanda and Ram Sevak with Aadhaar, and a whole collection of UPI and DigiLocker and all those digital public goods. That's another extraordinary achievement. And as you know, Priyanka and Anirudh, lots of countries are at the stage of not just expressing interest, but starting to adopt bits and pieces of it. So that's a technological achievement too, which is a bit of a leapfrog for the rest of the world, and so on and so forth. So there should be enough evidence for us Indians to say, my God, it's not a flash in the pan. This has been done over and over again. I have mixed views when people say jugaad, right? Because that is a double-edged sword. Every time I hear jugaad, I think, oh my God, somebody's going to think of, a poor, clever villager redoing the deal.
Right. That's the image that...
Those images we see on, WhatsApp flying around all the time. But really, that we've passed that age. Now we need to be putting significant oomph behind pure science, even basic science. Dare I say it, even for a developing country. And I'm happy to debate anybody who says that poor countries shouldn't do basic science. I think that's nonsense. We have to do it. Without doing that, you cannot absorb applied science. So it's a mixed bag. Short answer to your question.
No, absolutely. I think that I absolutely agree with you on the R&D piece. In fact, Professor Khanna, one of the key learnings or key conclusions I drew in my book also pointed, it's almost verbatim of what you were saying, that you look at, one of the main arguments I made in my book was that you need to go from being a talent nation now to becoming a tech nation. You cannot be happy saying that I'm going to be the provider of talent to the entire world and tech companies and management talent, engineering talent. There's obviously value in that, but you've really got to aim to be a tech nation, by which you need to be building tech, building core tech, core IP that you can then monetize and build companies that have moats around them that are technology and IP driven moats, and not just rely on venture capital.
I couldn't agree more. So Anirudh, you and I are in the risk capital business. I'm also an entrepreneur. I build companies. And what does a good entrepreneur do, right? At any time you look around and say, these are the cards that have been dealt. What's the best that I can concoct with the next phase of existence? So think of India as an entrepreneurial work in progress. Okay.
Yeah.
What we've done over the last 30, 40 years, we've built an incredible diaspora, right?
Yeah.
Incredible diaspora, not just the US, but all over the world.
Globally.
Very talented people. Generally, we have, it's a bit of an overstatement, of course, chased away talent from India over the decades. And they've retained ties to their country of origin in many instances. And that's an asset now for the new entrepreneur in India to grab onto and say, okay, how can we use that resource? This is what China did. You know, when I was traveling around China, learning Mandarin, you know, going to rural, villages in 20, 25 years ago, this is the thing that jumps out. I mean, the main lever being used by the Chinese at that time was to tap into the overseas Chinese because it's a resource. So India should figure out how to do that, not to the exclusion of what's happening in India, to nurture the talent, but precisely to unlock the talent in India, which is the real promise.
Yeah, and one of the first starting points of this R&D piece, right, that you've mentioned, by the way, this is starting to become, I would say, a topic of conversation across many tables now over the last year to 2 years.
Good.
I think it started, at least the first time I saw personally, and this is a paper I'm writing on the R&D piece, so I'm going to delve deep into this for a couple of minutes. You know, it started about 2 Independence Days ago when the Prime Minister delivered his speech from the Red Fort, and he said that to Jai Kisan and Jai, the other 3 big pieces we have, the soldier and the farmer, he said, let's add Jai Anusandhan, right? And it went largely unnoticed, but because I've been thinking about this R&D piece, I sort of saw the significance of it getting added to Jai Kisan and Jai, these other pieces that we tend to, Jai Jawan, etc. Right? And then, of course, a few months ago, you might have seen a few weeks ago rather, after the Modi visit to Prime Minister Modi's visit to the US, the NRF bill gets approved, right? You must have noticed that. Now, of course, that's 50,000 crores. The existing board is getting subsumed within it. But, there are some of these signs that are showing that there's a growing sense that that R&D argument that you just made, that no country has stepped up, right, without doing R&D. I think there's a growing realization, but nowhere near where I think it should be.
So now the NRF that you referenced is actually called the Anusandhan NRF.
That's right.
That's the full name. Apropos the comment that you just made about the Red Fort speech, which I do remember. But it goes back before that. My colleague K. Vijayaraghavan, I think one of India's most eminent biologists, used to run NCBS in Bangalore, became principal science advisor to the Prime Minister last term.
This is Professor Raghavan? Professor Vijayaraghavan?
Yeah, Professor Vijayaraghavan.
Yeah, of course. I spent a fair bit of time with him on the book.
So Vijay and I worked very closely for almost 6 years in his 2 terms, basically thinking of ways to seed what I think became the NRF 6 to 8 years ago. Not just us, but a whole constellation of well-wishers, scientifically minded. Then in my work at creating the Atal Innovation Mission at NITI Aayog, of course, that was not pure science. It was more unlocking entrepreneurship and creativity. But science was in the periphery. And all the public hearings that we had in Delhi back in 2015, 2014, 2016, in that time period, there was never a public meeting where science did not come up. So you knew that there was an audience for it. It just requires organizational inertia. And I think, again, my self-identity is as an entrepreneur, as an academic, I just say, these are the cards we've been dealt. We got dealt the card of digital public goods that Nandan and Ram Sevak and team have built. We got dealt the card of, the ISRO scientists landing something on the moon. We got dealt the card, Serum Institute and others building vaccines for the pandemic.
That's right.
Great. Let's use those and, 10x, 100x it in terms of resources and commitment. And nothing better than, Prime Minister Modi in charge. Well, it's a good thing that he chairs the NRF. So in the short run, of course, we have to get the private sector to step up. But there are many things we have to tweak the incentive systems for our scientists so they're incentivized to do this, that you separate out those who are willing and able to participate. This is what Vijay and I were working on in his last term. And I hope Ajay Sood, the current gentleman, Professor Sood from Institute of Science, who's now the PSA, will take it forward earnestly and 10x it. That remains to be seen. So we have to do that, and we have to get our private sector to step up. We have Chandrayaan, we have digital public goods and Aadhaar and UPI, and we've got vaccines.
Good.
So grab these.
You have those building blocks to sort of build on.
That's proof of concept. Right?
Yeah, because it also comes back to the reputation or sort of the image question that I think Priyanka started off with, which is really the title of our talk today also, right? How India features in the American zeitgeist, how that's changing. And for a very long time, and images of countries change, right? I remember when I came to the US for the first time, let's say over 20 years ago, India was not as positively viewed as it is today.
For sure.
People who, like you, who've been there for even longer, might argue that 2002 was a great time compared to, I don't know, the 1980s. And so as we move as India and its image in the global zeitgeist, but also the American one in particular, is your sense that the DPI piece, the Chandrayaan piece, the vaccine piece, right? The Bharat Biotech vaccine piece as well, are these sufficient starting points for that image to change? Because once that image changes, right, much like you said, Israel, tech nation, Korea, tech nation, the US, obviously tech nation, German industrial power, right? I mean, these images somehow hold a lot of influence over where investors will invest behind R&D, where they will invest behind deep tech startups, right?
And it's starting to happen. The entrepreneurial landscape in India is a huge accomplishment, one that I've been privileged to watch, study, participate in, benefit from in a variety of ways. I'm delighted at what's happened, but it has not become genuine venture risk mindset as yet. We just have not cracked that yet, and that again requires all the flywheels to spin. It requires the academic community to kick in. It requires the policymaking community to kick in, and I'm confident it will. The difference is whether it's going to kick in 5-6 years or 15-20 years. I'd rather see it in 5-6 years than 15-20 years.
Yeah.
And Professor Khanna, how is it looking for homegrown Indian businesses focusing on digital public goods, deep tech, geospatial? I mean, do you think now with this win of ISRO, do you think, are they going to be faring in a positive manner? And how do you think they're also going to do globally? I mean, do you think the political scenario for them is faring positive if they look to go global?
Well, it's a lot more positive, Priyanka, than it was, 6-9 months ago, a year ago, for sure, right? For a variety of reasons. And the sort of fillip that we get, the boost that we get as a result of Chandrayaan's success is terrific. And with digital public goods and the G20, putting India's image up front and center. My friend Amitabh Kant's done a nice job of being the Sherpa and telling the story over and over again. He's a masterful storyteller. So that's great. Is it really going to change the zeitgeist in a sustained way? That remains to be seen. I hope so. I'm, fingers crossed. I'm an optimist and sort of can-do person. So if I had to bet, I would bet on it. But there's a lot of work. There's a lot of work to be done. I want to tell you, when I was doing my comparative research on China and India, I wrote this book called Billions of Entrepreneurs, which was just an amazing, fun book to write and very, very successful in a conventional sense back in the mid-2000s. I think it came out in the late 2000s. And but I start that book, I still remember, with referencing a journalist book, Harold Isaacs, who wrote a book in 1976, I want to say, called Scratches on My Mind. And it was a comparison of India and China's image in America. And basically he said that India's image is, I don't understand why India's image is as poor as it is, or as wrapped up in, social, religious, caste type issues as it is. But there's a certain scratch on the American mind about China that predisposes the Americans to think of China in a more positive sense. I mean, that was his take on it. He was a journalist working on the East Coast somewhere, maybe even at Harvard for all I know. Harold Isaac. It was a beautiful book. It was a beautiful, thin book. And I often go back to that title, Scratches on My Mind. What is it that causes somebody's mind to be predisposed to think in a particular way. I got to say that a lot of the conventional Western media, I'm not talking about the online media, I'm talking about the conventional print media, to me seems like it was great to see the coverage of Chandrayaan, which was very positive.
Very positive.
Very positive. In general, the coverage, so I'm an avid reader of the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, even Financial Times. Particularly the conventional sort of liberal, left-minded newspapers generally tend to focus on poverty-related issues in India. Not that that's a bad thing. Of course, we should focus on things that are social issues that need to be addressed. Freedom of speech, religion, all this kind of stuff is of course super important. But I don't see the tech story being covered as much, and hopefully that.
Let's take off from, I think, one of the pieces you mentioned here, which was the second chunk that we wanted to focus on, which is taking off from the G20 summit that's coming up, right? I think that there's a lot of excitement that's been built up over the last year. It's almost now a full year leading up to the G20 summit. As you mentioned, Mr. Khan, there's the Sherpa, but really the extent of the working groups. And if you're living in Delhi, or in fact any city in India, any town in India, you will have noticed the G20, right? I spent a lot of time in a small hill town. You'll see it there. You go to Bhubaneswar, you'll see it there. I went to Bhopal for a literature festival. So the G20 had really become a big agenda item, I think, in the policy zeitgeist and the overall machine in India. So I wanted to get your views on how you've seen that evolve, right, over the last year, and what your expectations are from now the summit itself, given the recent news also that's coming out about how geopolitics might still reign supreme. But I wanted to get your views on how India's managed this whole G20 presidency.
I think the I was there at the last transition in Bali when Indonesia handed the baton, so to speak, to India with the presidency, and I will be there at the next baton passing to Brazil. But I have to say, I've not been, since I'm basing myself in Cambridge, Mass, I've not been on the ground with all the events, other than people pretty much every day reporting to me what's going on. I mean, one thing that I would say, well, two things. One, I think the you spoke about smaller towns. I was in Bhopal a few weeks ago with my daughter, who was doing some volunteer work for a mental health NGO, and it was G20 everywhere. You couldn't run into an animal on the road without seeing G20 in a billboard behind the animal. So the coverage has been. I
read that more people in India now know the G20, Professor Khanna. It's obviously a bit of a joke, than the UN.
That's probably true. So, the media hype has been expertly done. But more substantively, I think we have a real opportunity to I don't like using the phrase lead the global South. I don't know what that means, but to be a net giver to the global South, so to speak, to say that, look, there are all these attributes of the building that are good for humanity. And is there a way for us to share it? And I love what the digital public goods people are doing. Priyanka is talking about her work in Botswana, whether it's work in other North African countries, the Philippines, even France, Japan, other places. Just, spread the goodness that has come out of the entrepreneurial revolution in India to other countries that can benefit from it. That's an exercise in soft power that countries like China will never be able to match, in my view, in the short term, or the medium term, probably. And that's really something I'm excited to see starting to happen. I think the G20 has kickstarted that process, so I hope it continues. The other thing I would say is that there are some organizational innovations that have happened. For instance, again, since I spent a lot of time thinking about science-based entrepreneurship, there's something called the S20.
That's right, the Startup 20. Yeah.
Startup 20, which is run by my colleague Chintan Vaishnav.
Chintan Vaishnav was at MIT when I was at Harvard as well.
Yeah, I was on the board of the Atal Innovation Mission.
Yeah.
When we retained him as director, and he's been fabulous. But he's spearheading the S20. So the idea that this is something that I'm personally taking a lot of satisfaction in. The Atal Innovation Mission, which came out of a report that I chaired, is now influencing the startup environments in so many different countries. That's fabulous, and I'm sure there are others like that. About climate tech and education and health policy and so on. So I'm excited about that. So it should be fun. I'm sorry I'm not there at the actual tamasha in early September.
No, you'll be missed. But you're right that I think the T20, the think tank 20 has engaged a lot of think tank research institutions. The S20 has obviously engaged the startup world. There was always, I think, the P20, which just something happened last week. Also, so I think I agree with you on the institutional innovation, but on the substantive front, it seems that a couple of pieces were high on the Indian agenda, right? One was the DPI. I think that India really wanted that, as you were referring just recently about, wanted it to become a key digital public good that could be spread around the world, especially for countries in the global south. The other piece was, of course, climate, right? So I think one of the things I talk about in my book is that for India to become a tech nation, we need the R&D piece, of course. But the other thing you need to also figure out, if you look at history, is if you look at any country, whether it was the US taking over from the UK and Germany, etc., they tend to catch certain waves early, certain tech waves early, right? Whether it was electricity or whatever for the US, the steam engine for the UK, etc. And so, of course, for India, at some point, given that we have a lot of the pieces together now, the talent, the capital's coming in, policy, etc., the global, geopolitics is in your favor largely. There's a wave that you need to catch that can help you propel, your country up one notch at least. And to me, climate, artificial intelligence, these emerging technologies could be that. Now, as part of that, of course, climate finance has been a big focus of the G20. India wants affordable climate finance to be provided to it. But I wanted to ask you not so much about the affordable climate finance piece and the MDP reform piece, but the climate as an opportunity piece. You look at how the US, China, Europe are looking at climate. Yes, it's a challenge, but whether it's the IRA or the European Green Deal, you look at these regions and they are looking at this as a once in a lifetime, once in an era opportunity. One of these emerging tech waves that I referred to, that they want to latch onto and not be left behind. Is your sense that India is getting that? Is your sense that India is seeing this as an opportunity? Indian businesses that you interact with, Indian entrepreneurs you interact with?
Are there businesses that are seeing that as an opportunity? First of all, I like the characterization. It makes all the sense in the world that you catch a wave. And, the existential wave of our time is surely about climate change. So I get that. That makes perfect analytic sense. If you say, are there businesses that are recognizing this opportunity? Absolutely. Absolutely. Some of the software companies, the life science companies, people like the Tatas, probably the other big houses are seeing that there is across the board opportunity in climate related economic endeavors and climate tech in particular and so on. Equally important, I just think, again, as an entrepreneur and investor, there's going to be a few $100 billion a year of cash needed, investment cash needed in India to come remotely close to getting to even 2 degrees. Forget 1.5, 2 degrees, or maybe 2.2 or something. You need like hundreds of billions of dollars annually. That's a flow that's coming at you. So if you can position yourself as an entrepreneur, speaking to young alums now, right, or young people, it's the opportunity of your lifetime in some ways to build something that is socially useful, commercially viable, or to build a social enterprise or whatever you want, whatever moves your cheese, just do it. But it really is an amazing opportunity. But the other part of the question that I think you were asking, Anirudh, is does the private sector as a whole see this? And there my answer is no. It does not see it. There is an element of climate consciousness, climate literacy, climate branding that needs to be part of our own, in Hindi we say mahal, right? In our own gestalt, our own zeitgeist. That hasn't happened. Right? Pick your word, right? But that's not permeated. Now people are. So we have this conversation with Mittal Institute all the time, right? People, when you talk to people, you talk to a farmer, you talk to a laborer. We have this amazing research study going on, heat stress across the northern Indian plains, massive stress. And when you talk to people who have to live with the heat stress on a day-to-day basis, not you and me who go in an air-conditioned car, or an air-conditioned office, an air-conditioned house, but you talk to people who have to live it, they're perfectly aware of change. They're living it and they're adapting to it, but they're not using that terminology that allows them to aggregate experience and insight. So, Priyanka in her occupation might deal with greater heat in one way. In my occupation, I might deal with greater floods in another way. But unless the language system is common, we're not going to be able to shift. And that language, the commonality of language system has not kicked in. And I would blame us, the educated classes, for that. We need to start speaking, and that's happening. That part is happening. But it's work in progress.
Yeah, and interestingly, if I may add, it's I think linked to the R&D question that we were talking about. Climate, by almost definition, I think some of the solutions that we need here from a technological standpoint are not like simple consumer apps that I could build, right? These will have to be R&D driven tech innovation, right? If it's cooling, so now take my air conditioner, you've got to make it more energy efficient or find a completely different way that does not release those chemicals out. You need R&D. It's not like today, out of an MBA program, I can say, okay, now let me start the next e-commerce app or the next.
So this is where, coming back to other countries' experiences, we should not reinvent the wheel, right? This is where, and going back to the point of the role of the state, this is where the state can be very clever with financial engineering. You be things like funder of last resort, you be insurer of last resort, you de-risk cap table so that other people who might say, look, this is taking too long and it doesn't make sense for me to put money into this as an LP or a GP or investor of any sort. But if there is a backstop, right, from the state, which is what Israel has done way back when it started this thing, but there's a backstop that sort of underwrites, it's not quite the right term, but anyway, defrays the risk so that it kicks in the event of an adverse outcome. But just the fact that it kicks in probably reduces the likelihood of the adverse outcome. So
it's a reverse self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, so there's no cash outlay. So, to people who say we can't afford it, I say, you're so wrong. We can afford it. Not only can we afford it, it doesn't even need, the starting part doesn't need to cost all that much. So we can do a lot better, and it's all in here in our minds.
And the climate definition also, I think, is the other issue. Like, you look at climate tech and the way the field has been defined very broadly in other countries. And to your point, that the entire private sector in India might not be looking at this as an opportunity, but Tata might be, let's say, from an EV and battery standpoint. So EVs have captured the imagination of the Indian corporate, I would say, in the last year and a half. Solar panels and solar power plants have captured the imagination of Indian corporates of the last few years, I would say, at least, until we realize that maybe other than that, we're not looking at agri-tech, we're not looking at cooling tech, we're not looking at fertilizers that we need to replace from chemical fertilizers to non-chemical fertilizers, non-emissions ones.
The good news is that the opportunity is so huge that anyone with the right mindset, and what we need is for our society to organize to make it just a little bit easier for talent to kick in, so that, as you put it, we go from talent exporter to, as you say, tech exporter, make the tech at home, move up the value chain, so to speak, and benefit from it. It's very exciting.
Professor Khanna, any wins that you expect from G20 in terms of future partnerships or bilateral relations, a seat at the governing table on any kind of international bodies, or a seat in shaping regulation around digital assets? What do you think are going to be some wins that we can read about in the next few weeks?
So I think I'm out of my area of competence, Priyanka, on that one. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, certainly the areas that we've touched upon with DPI, digital public infrastructure, the Startup 20, Think Tank 20. I think there I would fully expect to see that those are, organizational and governance innovations whose time has come. So I'd expect them to get traction, and that can appropriately be credited to India's G20 presidency and effort. Seat on the government table and all the places that we've sought one for the last decades. That's a little bit above my pay grade at this point, so I don't really know how that's going to shake out. We are, of course, in a geopolitical moment that's really quite interesting, with China becoming less favored, shall we say, and the Quad countries and banding together. So there's a degree of receptivity to India that does not extend to China. And it's an opportunity for us. And it's an opportunity that, unfortunately, in the past, when it's come, we've squandered it. So I'm hoping, fingers crossed, if we don't squander it this time and capitalize on it in some ways. But it's an exciting moment to be connected to India in any way, and of course to be an Indian as I am.
When I came to the US, there was a lot of talk about brain drain from India, and that used to be a term that you would see everywhere. You don't see it as much now. Incidentally, by the time I was moving back about a decade after I came to the US, there was talk of a reverse brain drain, where you were finding a lot of Indian students, Indian professionals, Indian folks in Silicon Valley, managers in different companies, moving back to India. And you realize, fine, that there's some amount of talent sort of goes back and forth. But to the point we were making about R&D also earlier, so there's a lot of R&D talent sitting in the US. And, this is particularly the case for another paper I'm writing on artificial intelligence. A lot of the talent that comes out of the IITs of India and the NITs and the other institutes ends up doing their masters and PhDs in the US and ends up staying there, which might have been reversed. Maybe the MBA kind of student crowd might have been reversed in the Kennedy School crowd, but hasn't really been replaced or changed at the PhD level, right? So
no, it's not.
So how do we? When do you expect that to change? Or
we have to fix the universities. The PMO had asked me to create and then work on this idea of institutes of eminence some years ago, which was to essentially create a system that was fair to focus on a handful of maybe 10 public and 10 private universities. So that was chaired by Gopalaswamy, who was a former Chief Election Commissioner of India, and there were 3 other panel members, including me. And we put an extraordinary amount of time into creating a structure that was fair, transparent, meritocratic, not without controversy, but still. And then, unfortunately, the government didn't sort of drop the ball, in effect, by not continuing the effort. But the fundamentals are there, and I'm given to understand that people are revisiting the idea of institutes of eminence. That's the scuttlebutt that I hear in the halls in Delhi. And so I hope that they reconstitute it under some other set of committee members and invest in it. Because until we fix the governance of the universities and encourage free and untrammeled inquiry in science, but not limited to science. We've seen a lot of controversy at some of the universities in India recently about free speech and this, that, and the other, and research. So we just need to have a commitment to building a university structure that's world-class. And if we decide to do it, we will do it. I don't think it'll take more than 10 years to get it right and to start reversing that kind of brain drain also. I would have loved to build a research career in India. Why not? Why would I want to leave my home in Delhi or Punjab?
No, that's
but it's just not possible to be a world-class researcher in an Indian university currently, for the most part. And that's addressable. And it's in our interest to address it. So I hope we do.
I agree. I think that university and R&D piece, I think, is definitely, a key component of what we've taken away from today's conversation as the key thing that if India fixes, I think it'll expedite our journey to be a more, as you were saying, I think, more value-added, more of a tech nation. And as Priyanka, you'll remember Professor Ricardo Hausman at Kennedy, he used to say economic complexity. I think we've to move up in the economic complexity of the activities that we're doing in India. I think we've pretty much run out of time. I think
one quick question, Professor Khanna. I just read this morning that India's released 2 public manuals, open manuals that they're hoping to utilize to guide low-income countries or other emerging markets to pursue their digital public goods strategy. What's the opportunity here? I mean, they're really taking an entrepreneurial lens here, right? To be able to there and to be able to shape these other strategies. What do you think could be a potential roadmap that they could take on?
Well, that's a big question. I don't know if we have time to go into it, but I would just say that my thinking on this has been influenced a lot by, what Nandan and his team have shared with me over the past, almost decade. And my colleague and another Kennedy School graduate, Madhukar, who runs something called Co-Develop, I think is the...
Co-Develop is the new, that's right.
Yeah, so Co-Develop is basically squarely in this. Priyanka, you should be in touch with Madhukar if you're not already, but Co-Develop is essentially dedicated to spreading the DPI infrastructure to countries. And what I learned from Madhukar is it's important to actually treat the adoption of DPI itself as an entrepreneurial act, right? So understand your customer there. Your customer there might be, as you say, Botswana, it might be a different African country, it might be the Philippines, but their needs are going to be very much a function of their societal structure.
Yeah.
And think about what it is in our ensemble of toolkits that we've experimented with in India that can be made available to them. And I think that's the approach that I see emerging, and it's very encouraging. I'm really, very impressed and very proud to see it happening, and best wishes to all of you and to both of you. And I'm going to sign off because I really have to run.
So,
thank you so much for taking the time. It was an
over
absolute
1 hour of your time. Thank you, Professor Khanna. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for helping us launch this series. We appreciate your time today.
Wonderful.